If yesterday was all about one very grabby image, that of President Biden in his aviator sunglasses standing next to President Zelensky against a backdrop of one of Kiev's architectural jewels, well, today was all about a split screen. Two speeches from two presidents with the most glaringly different visions of what war in Europe means. The first to take to the podium was Vladimir Putin in Moscow. You'll hear from him in 30 minutes, and we'll try to work out what we can learn from his stark vision of the war in the West. We're going to begin, though, several hours later in the Polish capital, Warsaw, which is where Joe Biden was speaking.
1 year ago, the world was bracing for the fall of Kyiv. Well, I've just come from a visit to Kyiv, and I can report Kyiv stands strong. Kyiv stands proud, it stands tall, and most important, it stands free. When Russia invaded, it wasn't just Ukraine being tested. The whole world faced a test for the ages. Europe was being tested. America was being tested. NATO was being tested. All democracies are being tested. And the questions we faced were as simple as they were profound. Would we respond, or would we look the other way? Would we be strong, or would we be weak? Would all of our allies, would be united or divided? 1 year later, we know the answer. We did respond. We would be strong. We would be united. And the world would not look the other way.
It had been a test, in other words, not just of Ukrainian grit and determination, but Western resolve. And President Biden had this message for the people of Russia.
The United States and the nations of Europe do not seek to control or destroy Russia. The West was not plotting to attack Russia, as Putin said today. And millions of Russian citizens who only want to live in peace with their neighbors are not the enemy. This war is never a necessity. It's a tragedy. President Putin chose this war. Every day the war continues is his choice.
A promise then of unstinting support for Ukraine and unflagging criticism of the Russian leadership. But is it clear a year into this war what American strategy is, what Washington's view of the endgame is, and how to get there? Bill Taylor has served as ambassador to Ukraine under 3 US presidents, most recently in 2020. What's his view?
Tim, it could always be clearer. However, I think the long-term strategy in very general terms is clear, and that is a sovereign, independent, democratic Ukraine within internationally recognized borders that is able to make its own decisions, that's able to defend itself, which is economically viable. That's what I think the United States and indeed the Western Alliance wants for Ukraine.
It sounds understandable, but it also sounds like total victory. I mean, when you're talking about internationally recognized borders, for example, that means kicking the Russians out of every part of Ukraine that they currently occupy.
Well, it does. I think the Ukrainians would say, and probably the Americans as well, if you got into this level of detail, is it doesn't have to happen all at once. Yes, it is true that the United States and Americans in general believe in sovereignty and territorial integrity, and those are part of the UN Charter that we've all signed up for and believe. Then it cannot be that the Russians maintain a long-term presence in Ukraine. If they were to push the Russians all the way out of their country, out of Donbass, for example, it's possible that the Russians would want to negotiate. And the Ukrainians have said that they're willing to negotiate once the Russians are out. And part of the taking back of their territory, part of that can happen militarily, and part of that can happen diplomatically. For example, the Ukrainians and the Russians might be able to negotiate a demilitarized Crimea, for example, over some period of time.
I completely understand that at this point, the Americans, as Ukraine's other supporters would say, look, it's up to the Ukrainians to determine what victory looks like. It's not for us to put conditions down on this, and that there are some very important principles at stake here about, as you were saying, territorial integrity and Russian aggression and all the rest of it. I wonder, though, whether it is possible to see that American strategy and Ukrainian strategy could ultimately diverge, that there could be different views on what success would look like and how the war should be prosecuted.
Well, on the question of how the war should be prosecuted, I don't think there is a difference of view.
Well, forgive me for interrupting. There's been protracted differences of view over weapons. Most recently over fighter jets.
Well, it's so interesting that you say that, because the differences of view have gradually been eliminated. You're right. There were differences of view. We remember in 2014, the United States wasn't even given lethal weapons to Ukraine. We were providing non-lethal support. Then we went to Stingers and Javelins. The Stingers and Javelins have progressed all the way up to Patriots and HIMARS. This has changed over time.
But it's changed reluctantly and slowly. According to some observers.
I agree with that. Too reluctantly and too slowly. If we had made those decisions earlier, the Ukrainians would be in a better position today. However, the trend is right. It should be faster, and they need it faster in order to win.
You've talked about sort of the contours of what a possible victory could look like. How much thought is being given to what if this does turn out? Not necessarily into a really long war, but a war which is the fighting eventually ends, but it's not in a particularly clear or satisfactory way. One parallel I've seen invoked is Korea, where the fighting stopped. But of course, decades on, we still have two foes staring at each other over a demilitarized zone. Do you think that is, unfortunately, a possibility in this?
So that's an interesting analogy, and this because you take a look at South Korea. South Korea, in that case, developed its economy very well, developed its democracy very well, and I imagine it still intends in the future there will be reunification. Another parallel, Tim, is East Germany, West Germany. So there are examples in the past. That said, the Ukrainians are not ready to give up on winning. So they're not willing to talk about North Korea, South Korea, East Germany, West Germany yet.
We've talked, I guess for the sake of clarity, about the US as some sort of monolith here. But of course, US politics is anything but. And I was just wondering how far you think, given that everybody seems to suggest that the fighting is going to carry on for at least another year, how far politics, internal politics in the United States could play into all this and the American support for Ukraine?
Well, Tim, I'll answer your question, but let me address your premise. That is, everybody thinks it's going to last a year. I don't think it's going to last a year. I know there are people in Ukraine who don't think it's going to last a year because they and their generals are looking to make it faster, make it shorter, a shorter war. And they're looking at ways that they can break through Russian lines in months. And again, if the Ukrainians get the kind of a support that they are asking for, that's realistic. They could do that. They could break through Russian lines, and they could end this war in the way that we talked about earlier. Let me go to your second part of your question, which is how firm is U.S. support? No one knows what's going to happen in the future. I predict that the strong support that we see from the American people will translate into an election that will result in continued support for Ukraine.
Bill Taylor, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. President Biden delivered his speech in Warsaw. What's the view from Poland? The war in Ukraine matters there more than most countries. As well as taking in millions of refugees, Poland's provided the route for military and humanitarian supplies to enter Ukraine and recently helped persuade more reluctant allies to send battle tanks. Many Poles see the war Russia is waging on their border as a real threat. As our Eastern Europe correspondent Sarah Rainsford reports.
Racing across eastern Poland towards NATO's latest line of defence. These are German troops. sent to stop the war in Ukraine from spilling across the border. We were given access to their camp to see Patriot air defence systems now planted on Polish farmland. The landscape of Eastern Europe is being transformed by a war that seemed unimaginable just a year ago.
And how effective are they?
It's above 90%.
90%?
Yeah. So we're not the aggressors, we're just defending our own territory, our NATO territory.
The commander tells me all this is a message to Moscow to keep its missiles out of NATO airspace.
And can you definitely shoot those down? Can you definitely take them out?
Yeah, I'm convinced that we'll do it. As soon as it crosses the border, and it doesn't matter if it's an helicopter, an airplane, or a missile, we are allowed to engage this target.
The Ukrainian border is just about 35 kilometers the way that those missiles are pointing, and the German forces who operate them have told us that if there was a Russian jet or a Russian missile that crossed that border, then they'd have under 2 minutes to react.
The Patriots were brought in after 2 farmers were killed not far from here. That time it seems a Ukrainian air defence missile misfired, but it shook people in these borderlands. Adam tells me villagers worry the war that's so close to them will cross the border. They discuss that a lot here. It's why Poland has pushed its allies to arm Ukraine better for the fight, including with Leopard 2 battle tanks. We saw Ukrainian soldiers training on them here before they're sent to the front line. Like all Western weapons, the route in is through Poland. It's why there's talk of a power shift now in Europe to the east. And Poland aims to back that up with force. Weekend soldiers like Sylvia are part of a drive to boost interest in the military and create the biggest land army in Europe. People here say the threat from Russia seems more immediate, more real, though Sylvia herself isn't rushing to enlist.
The war is since 1 year with Ukraine. I need to feel more safety, so that's why I do this training. I will be very happy if I never use it, but I would like to have the skills.
The war Russia is waging on its neighbour is changing Poland too, right on the front line of the West's response.
Sarah Rainsford reporting from Poland, and we'll be heading to Moscow in 15 minutes to hear about what President Putin has had to say in this week marking the anniversary of the invasion he ordered. This is NewsHour. Also coming up on the programme, we'll be hearing how the US Supreme Court has begun considering a landmark case which could dismantle laws protecting social media giants from litigation over their content. We speak to the man who drew up the original piece of legislation for the internet in the 1990s.
The Supreme Court, unfortunately, is presented with the invitation to adopt a quite blunt instrument to achieve what is a pretty subtle and complex purpose. I think the question is whether those obligations should also come with the removal of this liability limitation that has been really critical for speech on the internet.
More on that and the all-important Section 230 in 20 minutes. You're with NewsHour, live from the BBC World Service with me, Tim Franks. And just before we came on air, a court in New York found Mexico's former Minister of Security, Genaro Garcia Luna, guilty of taking bribes from his country's biggest crime group, the Sinaloa drug cartel. The BBC's Neda Tawfik has been covering the trial for us. She's our New York correspondent. Neda, tell me a little bit about who Garcia Luna was and exactly what he was convicted of.
Well, look, he was once the highest-ranking law enforcement official in Mexico. In fact, he was seen as the public face of the war against, the so-called war against drugs in Mexico. He was trusted by the former Mexican president, Felipe Calderon. He was trusted by U.S. intelligence officials and the DEA, the FBI. He often gave talks about how to fight the cartels in the United States. But what this court heard was that all along, until he left government in 2012, that he was really protecting the Sinaloa cartel, the very cartel he was supposed to be, charged with taking down. And he did that by taking multi-million-dollar bribes in exchange for passing along sensitive information to them. In fact, apparently, he even gave the cartel members, the federal police forces, bodyguards and escorts and uniforms so that they could traffic their cocaine. And what prosecutors told jurors was that they were able to become this global cocaine empire, the Sinaloa cartel, specifically because of the help that Genaro Garcia Luna provided them.
And he was a man who worked really closely with the U.S. authorities, didn't he?
That's right. And look, there had been rumors for years about his complicity with the cartels. Felipe Calderon dismissed that. He trusted him. Many in the United States, saw that he was a partner they could work with. So they had to contend with those rumors. But what we heard from prosecutors today is that these criminal organizations can't function at the levels they do without corrupt officials like Genaro Garcia Luna. And they say that often makes life very difficult for U.S. officials. So they say this shows they won't stop pursuing these corrupt officials. And what we see here is that despite the fact that this case really rested on the testimony of cartel members who have been convicted for their own drug crimes, the jury was still willing to convict here. I mean, the defense unsuccessfully tried to say that these cartel members were just out for revenge and that he really was a family man, a trusted public servant.
I mean, as you mentioned, he was Mr. Security in Mexico. How far do you think that there is a feeling that there are more secrets in this among very highly placed people in Mexico to uncover?
Well, I think, look, in Mexico, people talked about being shocked but not surprised by this. I think you speak to anybody in Mexico, I've spoken to a few people who say, they do expect that there is that level of complicity with the cartels just because they have been able to get away with so much, to operate with impunity. But I think what we're seeing is that this will have implications on both sides of the border. But while prosecutors here in the United States thought that perhaps this was the start of them going not just after cartel members, but corrupt politicians, we saw that really ran into a roadblock when they tried to charge another politician, Salvador Cienfuegos. He's the former Mexican defense secretary, and Mexico got very upset with that, and they had to drop that case.
Now, think of Venice and you think of stunning palazzos, a warren of streets and the presence everywhere of canals. But right now, the picture in parts is rather not of waterways, but less lovely trenches of wet mud. Gondolas have been left beached on banks, building foundations have been exposed. Jane DeMosto lives in the city and runs the campaign group We Are Here Venice.
It's really just on the smaller side canals, even though it's super low tide level. There's water in the Grand Canal, there's water in St. Mark's Basin, there's water in the shipping lanes. So it really affects the side canals that are used by gondolas, delivery boats, and it reveals one of the critical issues to do with Venice today, which is the importance of regular maintenance. So when the water gets very low, we see just how far behind the administration has been in cleaning the canals. A lot of stuff accumulates in the canals. People are irresponsible and they throw away things. The tourism creates a lot of rubbish. The water traffic produces vibrations that cause the sides of the canals, the brickwork, to crumble. So times like this are really important opportunities to get a snapshot of the state of Venice and its fragility.
And I mean, I absolutely hear what you're saying. Indeed, it's been striking in some of the photos to see, the exposed foundations or sort of lower stories of buildings, and they don't look to be in great repair. When it comes, though, to the relative dearth of water, the lack of water in some of these smaller canals, what are we to draw from that, though? I mean, is this a problem that Venice encounters every so often, or is it connected to, what we're also hearing, which is that water levels elsewhere in Italy are dangerously low?
No, the low water level in the canals is linked to the astronomical tide, which is, the same everywhere according to the pull of the moon, combined with high atmospheric pressure that causes sea level to be lower. When there's high atmospheric pressure, sea level is suppressed. So there are issues in Venice, very significant issues to do with its survival in the face of climate change. But the low water level in the canal now is not to do with that.
And just in terms of what it means for life in Venice, I mean, yeah, again, I've seen pictures of gondolas beached. I'm not sure beached is the right word, but they're sort of stuck on these mud banks. Gondolas are presumably there to ferry tourists around. Does it interfere with daily life, though, in other ways?
I'm not actually sure if some of the routes, say, used by ambulance boats or the fire boats are affected by these ultra-low water levels, but I don't think so. I think it's really just the smaller, narrow canals, which are just used maybe by, as I said, by gondolas and the delivery boats, and maybe, it might be inconvenience for some taxis to take tourists to their hotel. On my way home this evening, I saw some French people have to do quite a long jump to get out of their gondola onto the steps on the side of the canal, and somebody from the bridge was a friend of the gondoliere, and he shouted, what are you going to do now? And the gondoliere was very happy to say he was just going to quit for the day and go and have a glass of red wine.